I am excited to be here. Happy Sabbath to you all. If you don't know me, my name is Pastor Anthony, and I get the honor of coming here in August and being young adult pastor, which is really cool. Between now and then, I get to come visit and see you guys like once a month, so that's super fun. It's a foretaste of what is to come, but it's always an honor, always a pleasure. If you haven't known, today is our last week in this mini-series that we've been doing called Encounter, where we've been doing these little snapshots of Jesus' encounters with people in the Gospels. And so today is our last week in Encounter, and we're going to cover one of my all-time favorite stories of all time. I said all time twice. Of all time in the Gospels, the woman at the well. It's such a good story. Definitely in my top 3. So that's where we're headed today. I'm very, very excited. Let's say a prayer, and we're going to dive right in. Jesus, thank you so much that you are so good. And we just celebrate you today, God. We're so grateful to be here. We're thankful for Sabbath rest, God, the chance we get to reset, we get to pause, we get to remember you, our love for us. God, would you just instill in us a spirit of rest and shalom today? We pray this all in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right, let's rock and roll. We're going to dive right in. Do you guys remember, maybe, I don't know if I'm speaking to the older people in the crowd here or the younger as well, but do you remember in elementary school, there was a time that I remember in like 4th through 6th grade where like trading food at lunch was a big deal. It was like a really, really big deal. Like lunch trading was the thing that I looked forward to every day. And I don't know if this still happens, but I remember when I was growing up and when I was going to elementary, lunch trading was the thing. It was such a big deal, in fact, at least in my school, that I remember like planning my lunches based off of like what I would trade later. So, like, when my mom would go to, like, Walmart or whatever, go to the store, I would be just, like, thinking. I'd be, like, playing 4D chess in my head. I'm like, okay, I need to, like, what am I going to plan? If I get some, like, gummy worms, then that means, my friend Clifford will be able to trade me for his brownie. And I remember, like, trying to, like, plan ahead and, like, create a system. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but I remember this was, like, a huge deal for me. And I thought, man, if I can just bring the good stuff, then someone is going to trade with me, and I'm gonna get like I'm gonna like play the stock market of elementary school lunch. Like I'm gonna end up on the positive. Like I remember being super, super stoked. And there's different tiers of lunch tradable foods, right? On the bottom tier is anything like veggie related, right? When you're in elementary school. I'm not saying it should be this way, but I feel like it is usually. And anything veggie related, right? That's like the bottom tier. And then like one tier up is like sandwiches. And some moms and dads, it's 2023, so some parents, at the time, when I was a kid, I just had this idea that only moms knew how to make good sandwiches. But now I'm like, no, that's not gender-based, that's silly. But a good, solid sandwich. There's nothing like a good, solid sandwich. But not all sandwiches are created equal. You're basic PB&J, right? And then you have like, PB&J might be at the top. But then there's like a solid like turkey sandwich, I don't know, for the meat eaters, or tofurkey, or whatever other. Pick your brand of veggie meat. But there's like there's the meat sandwiches. Hey, Eden, good to see you, bro. There's like there's the veggie meat sandwiches, and then there's kind of above that there's any sort of baked good, right? There's all the different baked goods. Like if someone had a baked good like any sort of brownie, cookie, donut, bruh. A donut? Someone had a donut, that was like a win for me. I was like, yo. Usually people aren't trying to trade a donut, though. Like, if you have parents that let you bring a donut to lunch in elementary school, you're not trying to give that donut away. Like, you're gonna get, like, a lot in return for that donut. But I remember, at least in my elementary school, at the very top of the list for a while, for like a couple years, there were these weird things, and I have a picture of them for those of you who are not from this era. If y'all don't know anything about a Lunchable, I remember being in elementary school and Lunchables was it. Lunchables was the thing. If you had a Lunchable, you were like the king of lunchtime trading. You were like, you were the Elon Musk of lunchtime trading, essentially. If you had a Lunchable. And I remember this being such a big deal at my school. It was only like a few kids who had a Lunchable, and they knew they had pure gold on their hands because they'd come to school with a kind of a smug look. I remember one of my friends, he'd come to school with a smug look on his face, like, guess what I have today? Lunchable. I got a Lunchable. And if you had a lunch, I remember this being like the Holy Grail. So I remember like I'd go to the store and I'd be at Walmart again. Once again, my mom would be buying like lunch foods and I'd be like, can we please get a Lunchable? Please, can we get a Lunchable? And my mom was like, no, because my mom believes in health. And my mom, she's going to listen to this, so I need to give her a shout out. My mom is she's not a health nut. I don't like that term. She is a health enthusiast. She believes in health quite a bit. And so because of that, she would never, ever allow me to get a Lunchable and bring it to school, which I'm grateful for. Thank you. Thanks, Mom. Because I remember one day the impossible finally happened. I finally got a Lunchable. And I remember eating it, or like pieces of it, and realizing something terrible happened when I had this Lunchable. I realized I didn't actually like it very much. And here's the problem is, like, I think I'm too Adventist because most Lunchables are, like, super meat-based. Like, even look at this picture. It's, like, 80% meat, like, something pretending to be a pizza beneath it. They're so meat-based. Like, lots of them have ham and sausage and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I'm a Stripples guy, Okay, yeah, there we go. I'm not the only one. Like, I'm a Stripples guy. So I'm like, I ended up not even liking it because I'm like, half of the stuff I can't eat, I'm not eating. And then the other stuff is just like, the portions are super tiny. And it's just like, it ended up not being what it cracked up to be. And I ended up learning an interesting truth back in, 5th grade during my Lunchable fiasco. This taught me something true about human nature. This interesting thing that we experience, that as humans, we all end up desiring things, right? We see things in the world and we end up desiring it. Man, I want that thing. No matter what it is, I want that thing. And we crave it and desire it. And I remember, man, I was thirsty for this Lunchable. I was a thirsty boy. I don't usually do this, but turn to your neighbor and say, you're thirsty. You're thirsty. I remember I was a thirsty boy for this Lunchable. I would crave it. I would dream about it. I would have dreams. I would have waking dreams about this Lunchable. I was just like, man, I feel like the anticipation, the hype was building up. And there's nothing worse than when you have like unbelievable hype, right? Like, I don't know if any of you had unbelievable hype like for a movie or something like that. And then you end up, seeing the movie or getting the thing or experiencing whatever was hyped. And it just doesn't live up to the hype. And you're just like, oh, that wasn't it. Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Sorry, what? If you disagree, we can talk about it. It didn't live up to the hype. And I think often we end up in these moments in life where we have this experience as humans, where there's a thing we have our eye on. Man, if I could only get that thing, then I'd be cool. And this was my thought. If I could only get that Lunchable, man, then I'd be cool. I'd be the coolest in school. Then I'd be cool. Then I'd be accepted. Then I would be really enough, right? And that's what's beneath the surface. If I can only get my hands on that thing, date that person, get that career, have X amount of money, have that car, get that parachute, whatever it is, get that degree. If only I could get that thing, then it would make me enough. But then we end up getting that thing, and something weird happens. There's almost nothing sadder than the day that you get the thing. Isn't that weird? You get the thing, and you're just like, oh, it actually doesn't fill the heart. Whoo! And the woman at the well, she experiences something similar. So what we're going to do, I'm going to do a little recap. We have Jesus. He's been doing ministry for a little bit. And this happens in John chapter 4. We're going to read really fast. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making disciples and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. Important verse. He had to pass through Samaria. Interesting. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, he was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. So here is the roadmap for today. I just have two brief observations for you. Two brief observations about this story, and then a final question I want to ask you at the end. Two brief observations. First observation, number one, Jesus went out of his way to meet with an outsider. Jesus went out of his way to meet with an outsider. Now, there's a lot going on underneath, bubbling beneath the surface of this story. And this is why I love this story, because there's so much going on in the subtext. There's so much going on. It seems like a rather benign meeting. Maybe Jesus comes, he finds this woman, she's at a well. They have a conversation. But there's a lot going on underneath the subtext. The first is geography. The text says Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had to pass through Samaria. What we know when we look at geography is this really isn't true. Actually, going through Samaria is actually a huge detour. It's a big inconvenience for him. So he didn't have to go through Samaria. That's the first thing. He didn't have to, and yet he chooses to. Number two is race. Now, maybe some of you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, classic Bible story. Lots of us, we heard that growing up. And that story is important, the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells it when one of the religious folk, they say, hey, who is my neighbor? Because Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the most important commandments. And then the religious figure comes back and says, well, who's my neighbor? And so Jesus answers with this story about the Good Samaritan. Now, the story is important because it illustrates essentially this sort of racial tension that existed between Jews and Samaritans. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But essentially, Jews did not interact with Samaritans if possible. In fact, many believe that at the time, they kind of equated like interacting with, touching, speaking with a Samaritan, similar to the purity laws. You couldn't, eat unclean meat. There's all these ritualistic laws around washing and bathing and things like this. So a lot of them, we're not going to touch a Samaritan. We're not going to talk to a Samaritan. We're not even interact with a Samaritan. But it kind of went deeper than that. It was deeply racial for them. Because essentially, to make a long story short, when the exile happened, this is when Nebuchadnezzar, right, and his armies, they came to Israel, and they took Daniel, they invaded, they took a lot of people there, they took them captive as slaves. When the exile happened, and a lot of Israel went to Babylon, and they went into exile, the Babylonians didn't take everyone. They actually left people. So they left a lot of people. They would kind of prioritize like the rich and the wealthy, ruling class, stuff like that. So they took like Daniel and his friends, Daniel, Meshach, Abednego, and his friends, and they took a lot of the ruling class, princes, lords, ladies, stuff like that, as what we would say. But they actually left a lot of people there. A lot of the Israelites, they just left there. A lot of the poor folk, they just stayed. And over time, those people that stayed, they ended up just marrying other people in the local regions, intermarrying, stuff like that. And about 600 years or more, over 640 years passed between the time when they went into exile and the time when they came back, which was a hot minute. It's a really, really hot minute. So there's all these generations of people that are like, we've been living here. And then when the Israelites come back, they're like, hey, this is our land. This is our holy land. Like, this is our city. These are our cities. This is our land that God gave to us. And the Samaritans are like, who are you? Like, I've been here for like 10 generations. Like, I got my great-great-great-great-grandfather. He lived here. Like, who are you? And so they had this deep underlying racial tension and animosity as the Jews came back from the exile that's kind of bubbling underneath the surface. So Jews and Samaritans did not get along because of this. There's also religious tension. The Samaritans claimed that they could worship God on their mountain, whereas the Jews claim that they're supposed to worship God in Jerusalem at the temple. So they have this religious tension. So we have race, we have religion. There's a lot of stuff going on beneath the surface, but we also have gender, and this is really the kicker. We also have gender going on. Jesus comes and he speaks to this Samaritan woman, right? So he's already crossing lines by speaking to a Samaritan, right? Because Jews didn't speak to Samaritans. They didn't interact with Samaritans. So he's already crossing lines. He just goes, hey, can you give me a drink? He speaks to the Samaritan. But this was not only a Samaritan. This was a Samaritan woman. And in Jewish culture, men didn't speak to women often, especially outside of their family. Men didn't approach unmarried women outside of their family and have conversations. This was considered highly inappropriate. And I mean, as a lot of us know, at this time in Judaism, they're living in a highly patriarch society, patriarch-dominated society. So men kind of controlled everything. They dominated everything. If you were a woman in that culture in that time, you needed to attach yourself to a man in order to have any sort of security or future or family. Because if you didn't, you'd either be living in poverty, you'd have to do all sorts of other means just to survive. And so being a woman in this time was difficult. It was a very different time period than our time. I mean, women were pretty much excluded from a lot of the temple services. They could only go so far into the temple, into what's called the court of women. They couldn't even participate in the full temple services during that time. And essentially, most Jewish, learned men would not be caught having, an intelligent conversation with a woman. It just wasn't something that was done. And yet, Jesus comes to her, and he engages her. So he's crossing racial boundaries, cultural boundaries, and gender boundaries all together at the same time, simply by saying, hey, can you give me a drink? And not only that, as the story goes, he ends up having conversation about her. He asks her about her personal life, highly inappropriate. And then they end up having an intellectual discussion about faith, about the place where they're supposed to worship. So he's doing all sorts of things. But the result is that Jesus is crossing multiple layers that should exist between him and her. He's breaking these barriers that existed, that were entrenched in their society. And it really speaks to me, the fact that Jesus knew her story. He knew her story, he knew her experience, and he goes out of his way to interact with her. He goes out of his way to meet with her, that he sees her. That he actually had an idea of her journey. It speaks to the power of seeing, and it brings to mind this quote by the author Brené Brown. I think I have it up here, where she says, never underestimate the power of being seen. Never underestimate the power of being seen. It's exhausting to keep working against yourself when someone truly sees and loves you. The power of being seen. And maybe some of you experience this, where you've just had something on your heart, and you have either a close friend, a family member, significant other, you've shared it, and they've actually listened and heard you. Man, it just takes the load off, right? It takes the load off when someone actually hears you and they say, man, I see you, I hear you. I'm picking up what you're putting down. So in the same way, I think the word for us today from that observation is just, man, God sees you. He knows you. You are known deeply. He knows your pain. He knows your story. He knows the struggle. He's seeking, he's actually not only just passive, but he's coming to you. He seeks you out. And I love this story, man, because sometimes we have this idea, man, I have to work so hard to find God somehow. No, in this story, Jesus comes to her. He goes out of his way to find her. She's not a Jew. She's not part of his religion. She's considered an outsider, and yet he comes to her. So I just want to speak a word to you today, this morning, from me, Pastor Anthony. And we're going to talk more about this in the fall. We're talking about how we're going to start off in the fall with Elevate. And I've been trying to, think and talking with Pastor Michael and just thinking about man, where are we headed? What are we sort of focusing on? I want to talk about what it's like to be a church like this Jesus. And this is a piece of this. So we'll talk more about that in the fall, but I just want to speak this word to you. If you have ever in your life felt like an outsider, like you're not cool enough, athletic enough, smart enough, pretty enough, good looking enough, Adventist enough, Christian enough, if you feel like you've ever felt like an outsider in the room, if you feel like you're on the outside looking in, man, you're in the right place. This is the spot for you. And this Jesus, he actually seeks out people like that. He wants to know you, and so do I, and so do we. So if you've ever felt that way, man, if you felt like an outsider, if you're like, man, I don't know if there's space for me. I don't know if there's room. I don't know if I believe all the things. That's okay. You're in the right place. This is the place to be. If you've ever had doubts, you've ever had questions, that's okay. You're scared, you're worried, you're angry at God, perfect. Yo, let's have a conversation. This is the place to be. So that's my first observation, man. Jesus, he goes out of his way to seek out the outsiders. Number 2, Jesus comes to bring what she's been searching for. He comes to bring what she's been searching for. So something intriguing happens. I want to lead you on a little goose trail. Something intriguing happens in verse 15. He says, right, everyone who drinks of this water will surely, they'll want water again, right? But I'm actually offering water that gives you eternal water, living water. And she says, okay, bet, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. Yo, I'm in, let's go. And then immediately, Jesus does something interesting. Watch what he does. We're going to read John 4, verse 16. He says, Jesus said to her, go, call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, true, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. Now, this is an interesting exchange happening, and how I used to interpret this essentially was that this woman is only a victim only. And the way I used to think about it was like, okay, this is a patriarch-dominated society. She may have been victimized by a man, super common in those days. Oftentimes men would just marry a woman temporarily, but then if they didn't like some minor detail, she's not pretty enough, she doesn't cook bread enough, bread good enough or whatever, they just divorce her on a whim. And this is why Jesus, he talks about divorce later on, and he's saying, man, don't just divorce someone on a whim, like, man, only for adultery. Like, don't just divorce someone because you don't like how they look or you had a bad conversation or, And so oftentimes women were kind of subject to the whims of men in this time. And in Jewish custom, they had this rule where, like, if your husband died or passed away, then the brother, he would marry you in order to take care of you. But this is an interesting scenario, because Jesus seems to indicate that something sus is going on beneath the surface, something suspicious, something's happening here. Something in her world, on her part, something that she's doing. So she's not only a victim here, she has a role to play somehow. By saying, the one you have now, he's not your husband. You're living with someone, you're sleeping with someone, he's not your husband. Now we need to pause here and recognize something important. Truth is not shame. Do you hear what I'm saying? Truth is not shame. To recognize a truth does not necessarily mean shame needs to be attached to truth. And Jesus does this super well. He actually speaks to hold her accountable. He calls out the truth, and yet he does not shame her. And Jesus is so good at this. He does this so often, right? The woman caught in adultery, she comes to him, and he's like, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. It is sin, but I don't condemn you. That's actually crazy, because often we're the opposite. Often we're the opposite. Often we're just like, man, I condemn that. I judge that. That's wrong. You're wrong. That's usually where we start. We're usually like, nah, don't do that. That's wrong. Jesus, he flips it. He starts with, it's the truth. We're going to acknowledge the truth. This is a thing. You are doing that thing. I don't condemn you, but you do that thing. He has this interesting balance of truth and accountability, grace, man, and kindness. Man, God is so kind. And I just believe he's the same for us, because he knows all your mess. He knows what you're doing in the dark. He knows what you did last week. He knows what you did 2 years ago. He knows about the thing. You can't hide from him. And yet, man, he meets you with love, with compassion, with kindness, with patience. So Jesus offers her living water, and she says, bet, I'm down, 100%. I'm in. And he says, immediately he pivots to her personal life. He says, oh, you want living water? Go get your husband. Almost as if to say, I can't fill your jar with my living water if you keep trying to fill it with yours. I'm going to say it again. I can't fill your jar with my living water that will always satisfy you if you keep trying to fill it with yours. What does this mean? What does this look like? I don't know what that looks like for me and for you. Well, I know what it looks like for me, but only you know what it looks like for you. Jesus isn't going to, we've talked about this before, he's not going to force you. He's not going to fill the jar and give you the thing if you keep saying, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to fill it. I'm going to be satisfied of my own accord. And it brings to mind one of my favorite verses in the whole scripture, Jeremiah 2:13. We have the prophet speaking, Jeremiah. He's calling out the people of Israel. He says, speaking on behalf of God, for my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and they have hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Ooh, it's cutting. And I think it's cutting because we resonate, perhaps, right? There's that word in there, cisterns. That's kind of an old-timey word. Essentially, that was just like a reservoir of water that they would make because they lived in desert areas. So they make this little reservoir like a little well, and they would store up water in there. But sometimes the cistern was broken. There'd be a crack in the cistern. Water would either evaporate or it would leak. And what's happening here is that the prophet, he's essentially saying, hey, Israel, you're worshiping idols. You've replaced me as the source. You used to run to me. But somewhere along the road, you replaced me with something that didn't ultimately deliver. You used to just run to me. I used to be the source. I used to be your God. I used to be the king. I used to be your well. But somewhere along the way, you said, nah, I'm going to go to this other well. I'm going to find my source in this other well. I'm going to find my significance in this other well. I want to feel good, so I'm going to go to this other well. Somewhere along the road. And this is really where my heart lies today as I wind down here. This is where my heart is for you and for us. I wonder if any of us find ourselves in the same position as this woman today. She's coming to this well every day, and yet she has to come every single day. And Jesus says, I could give you water. You would have it once, and it would satisfy you for your whole life. And yet she keeps coming to this well every single day, hoping to be satisfied. And I just wonder, man, maybe you're like this woman, you're going to this well. I don't know what that well is for you. I don't know what that thing is. Maybe you've dug for yourself this well, this cistern, created this thing. I don't know what that is. Maybe you've created this thing and you filled it with this water and you're like, man, I'm gonna drink from this thing. It's gonna satisfy. But I think the hard truth is that it never does. And I have had I don't know if it's the privilege or the misfortune of discovering that in my own life. Plenty of times in my life where I'm like, man, if I could only get that thing, or man, I'm just going to cope in this way. Let's talk about coping. And I don't know, again, what it is for you. But I'm going to run to this thing because it seems to help. I'm going to run to this thing. I'm going to go to this thing to rescue me, or go to this person to rescue me, go to spending to rescue me, go to this addiction to rescue. I don't know what it is. Go to eating food. I'm going to call up that person who I know is always down. You catch my drift? But I just want to let you know it'll never satisfy. And again, I'm not coming from a place of judgment. I'm coming from a place of having been in it with you, that you seek after it, and the more you seek after it, the actually more it begins to take from you. Because if a cistern was broken and it was leaking, man, it ends up taking more than you're putting in. It ends up taking more than it gives you. So after a while, you're putting in more and you're putting in more and you're putting in more, and it's stealing the life away from you. And I don't know if any of you have ever found yourself in that position where you've been just putting your whole, your hope into this thing, and it ends up stealing more life from you than it ends up giving. And man, that is a tough place to be. And the hardest part is that it actually works for a while. Oh, it actually works for a while. A broken cistern could have water for a while, for weeks, for months. You wouldn't even notice the little crack where it's siphoning away. And yet, man, after a while, it starts to take a toll. And so I just want to speak that word to you over your life, man. You don't have to go to the broken cistern. That there's actually a real well with real water. His name is Jesus Christ. Man, he's always here. He's always down. All you have to do is turn and say, I want that water. I want that water. So, one final verse and then we're in. We'll close. We're at the end. John 4:28. And this is the part I want to focus on. And this is the ask for all of us, I think. So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to, I just want to focus on the first part. The woman left her water jar and she went away. The woman left her jar and she went away. And ultimately, I think that might be the ask for us. And I never actually noticed that part in the story before. She comes to the well with this jar to fill, and she leaves it there when she's done with Jesus. So ultimately, I think that might be the ask for us. Maybe that's the ask for you. I don't know what that jar is for you. I don't know what well you've been going to. I don't know what it is. Only you know that in the depths of your heart. But God knows too. And I'm just here to say that those wells, ultimately, they don't satisfy. There's only one that does. And when I say don't satisfy, I mean oftentimes they end up just leading to our own pain. They end up leading to our own disillusionment. They end up leading to our own hard-heartedness. Man, but there's a real well with real water that's alive, that's active. And I feel like the longer that I've lived going back to it, the more I can say, oh man, God, you're so good, that you're actually what I need. And I don't have to go to this other thing because I have you. So let me pray that over you. Why don't we all stand together? I want to pray that over you as we end. Jesus, I just want to pray a prayer of broken cisterns today. That feels like a weird prayer, but I just want to pray a prayer of broken cisterns over every person, God, that we would all come to see how broken the cisterns that we build for ourselves are. God, that they don't satisfy. And I'm not saying some of these things are good. It's fun to buy new things. It's fun to have new relationships. It's fun to eat food. God, these are just examples. And these are good things that you've given us in the world, God, but sometimes we end up turning these things into idols. We end up running to these things that ultimately don't satisfy. So I just pray today, God, for every person, God, you would reveal to us the places where we're running to things that are not you, and that you would help us to see how futile it is. And that you would remind us that you have everything that we need, that our deepest desire of our hearts is actually for you. We pray this all in the name of the one who died, rose again, Jesus. Amen.